missed any, thank you. If anybody missed the first couple of weeks, and you desire to access it, the recordings are on Zoom. All the handouts are available on, for the Zoom recordings are on the website, and all the handouts are there as well. And I believe David's already got the link to the handout in the chat for Zoom if you're on. Next week, we're going to cover chapters 10 and 11. Then that will be week 6, and then week 7, we'll wrap the book. And then week 8, we'll do a kind of a big picture review of what all has been given to us and how should we think about it, what criticisms might we have of it, and what do we do with it moving forward. So the last week, I'm planning on not having content as much as to look back at the previous 7, do kind of a bird's eye view, and then have some conversation about how we think about what's been given to us. I believe that's all of the announcements. Am I missing anything? Does anybody have questions, concerns, comments there? Yes.
Even after we're gonna miss 1 week because Pastor candidates.
That's a good
The
question.
21st.
The 21st. That's right. Yes, we will. We'll take that week off. And then we'll come back for 1 or 2 after that. Do you remember?
Yeah. So the annual meeting is much later this year, December 5th, Sunday morning, December 5th. So meet the candidates, that means meet the candidates is later than we're normally used to it. I think it's the 21st.
I think that's right. So I'll make a note to myself to look at the specific dates. I'm not bringing those for next week, but we did adjust the calendar based on meet the candidates. And Brad's looking into that right now. For the online folks, the question was just about if we're going to take a week off for meet the candidates. Okay, so, but Brad, whenever you find that, feel free to interrupt me too.
So we finish on 11/14 and 11/21 is meet the candidates.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll wrap on November 14th then, and the following Sunday is meet the candidates. And that would be, yeah, that would be the 8th week, I believe. Okay. Oh, you're so fine. Let's start with last week's takeaways, and then we'll look at chapter 8, which is the great seas, and chapter 9, which clarifies some of the apocalyptic war, Christmas victor content. And I imagine that you're probably, if you've read any for this week, you're probably starting to see the way that the motifs are very interrelated and are so woven together. So I feel like each chapter we go into, at this point, we're starting to see the way that it's related to the previous stuff. We've got little teasers or tasters ahead of time, and now we're getting extra nuance and detail. So, okay, well, let's look at last week's takeaways. The big point that Rutledge was making last week in chapter 6 and 7 is that Jesus positions himself as an efficacious sacrifice for the whole human race and the cosmos for all time. It is, she was really stressing, I'll say, that God is both making a way out of our situation, and God is the way. God's the one who sends God's self to be the way out of the problem. So it's God who ordained the way in which justice and mercy would be enacted for the sins of the world, and God becomes that way. We talked a lot about sacrifice. If you'll remember the kind of complex argument, Rutledge names the recent feminist criticisms of the theological use of sacrifice. She talks about how, like, the validity of some of those concerns, or all of those concerns, really. And then she toys around with sacrifice as an idea and says, we actually want to keep this, but we want to keep it in a way that doesn't play into any of the negative social effects that feminist theologians have been concerned about. So she says the criticism's right. The answer is not to toss out sacrifice. The answer is to actually develop a new understanding, a legitimate understanding of sacrifice. And then she gives us that. She gives us that new definition. And she even says when a sacrificial trope is negatively used for the sake of repression, it should be both resisted and condemned. But she wants to rethink sacrifice in terms of power so as to more properly avoid its current associations with weakness and abjection. The two components of the definition for sacrifice that she gave us was giving something of value for the sake of receiving something greater. So any sacrificial trope where you're just giving and not receiving something greater is not actually sacrifice. It's just it's something different. We talked about how she's going to phrase redemption in terms of ransom. Oh yeah, and she likes the idea of ransom precisely because it comes as a cost to God. And she's not thinking about the debt that you owe, God's intervention, God sending Jesus to save us in the world, save you. It costs God something, and it's not to remind you of your debt. The idea of the cost is to say, like, God's really got some skin in the game, right? This is pretty intense exchange that happens where Jesus leaves behind the heavenly righteousness and praise, comes into a lowly position at significant cost. That's supposed to tell us something about the extremes to which God has gone in order to be present to us in our situation. Okay, and then we paused on F and G because those are actually takeaway points for today. So we'll get there. All right. Questions or comments about last week's stuff? Sacrifice, cost, and ransom. God is the way. Who makes the way? Okay. If you have questions at any point, if anything's unclear, or you just want to make comments, just interrupt me. Happy to have it. Let's look at chapter 8, the Greatest. There's a long-standing tradition of thinking about salvation in terms of a law court, like the context that we are given to imagine the way that our righteousness or our sin is dealt with before God. The metaphor is, I think a lot of this is probably downstream from the Reformation, where this is really prioritized. But also prior to that, there's just histories of reading Paul in this way, where the law court imagery or the law court scenario is kind of the operative image or metaphor for our salvation process. Fleming Rutledge wants to kind of pivot away from that image or that metaphor. And she says it is in Paul, it's definitely there some, but she's going to give us a kind of a different context by which we can understand that. And in this traditional law court reading, it makes some sense where there's an idea of a righteous judge who is saying whether or not, who is saying you are guilty, who is ascribing a sentence of what is the consequence of your sin. And then the idea is that you can be restored to righteousness because somebody else is paying the sentence for you. So Jesus steps in to carry out the sentence. Your status goes from guilty to righteous. This is why the reformers really like the law court imagery, because there's a total flip of your standing before God. Even if in that moment they think it's not something that you have earned by yourself. It's not something you have done. You've not paid out the sentence for the crime. But in a legal sense, your status is totally changed because somebody else has carried it out. That is the stand. Whenever we're going to talk today about law court imagery, that's what Fleming Rutledge has in mind. It is the guilty verdict, the sentence being carried out by someone else in a way where your status changes to righteous before God as judge. She's going to say that this law court imagery is much less prioritized and common in the New Testament than apocalyptic imagery. She says it's there, but it's there way less frequently than apocalyptic imagery. And it's still present and important. So the question is, how do we situate these two things together? And we're going to get more about apocalyptic in the next chapter, but just remember, it's the idea of something from the outside coming, some new thing from the outside, breaking open your situation, right? We're so chained up to sin. We've consented to sin in a way like so repeatedly that we can't get out of it now. We're captive. And the apocalyptic image is that this new thing from outside of our situation breaks in to create a new possibility. So when we're thinking about law court imagery from the perspective of the apocalyptic stuff, Fleming Rutledge wants to stress that the binary of guilty and innocent actually loses its meaning. And that binary is kind of what makes the law court image run. You were guilty, that was your status, the verdict, because you sinned, and then you were made righteous because of Jesus, right? But what Fleming Rutledge is saying is that the binary of the law court, guilty or innocent, is actually like totally overcome in the apocalyptic narrative. When Jesus comes and like defeats capital S semi-autonomous sin, we kind of get beyond just a innocent guilty thing. There's something more happening than just the change of your status. I do think that's the main concern here, that she wants to say there's something more to Jesus's crucifixion than just the change of your status from guilty to innocent or righteous. All of those in bondage to forces, all are in bondage to forces much bigger than any single individual. So it's a defeat of the powers of sin and death and the devil, as well as your change of your status and your release from bondage to those things. The law court imagery is just a small part of it, she's saying. So she's going to turn to the apocalyptic promise of God's coming judgment of the powers and the full instantiation of the coming kingdom. This week, we're going to get a little bit more about the end, or like the final defeat of death and sin. Because remember, there's like we can think of the narrative in big sweeping chapters. We've got creation, God creates the world, God continues to uphold it while it kind of plays out historically. Sin and the fall happens, God chooses God's people. There's the Passover and Exodus. It's like the first, like God hears the cries of God's people. It's the first intervening story where there's a massive liberation, rescue, exodus. She uses that same narrative to talk about the crucifixion, but it's bigger in scale, people involved. It's like once and for all time. It's what happens in the crucifixion. And then there's the question of, okay, so what do we do now? We're on this side of the crucifixion, but we're still like playing out the after effects of the crucifixion. Sin has been overcome and defeated, and yet it's not totally gone, right? So we're going to get a little bit more about the interim today by way of this apocalyptic narrative, because Rutledge thinks in the end it's totally done and defeated in Christ's return. So we've not talked too much about that final end or final return yet, but we'll get a little bit more of the information about it today. She'll even use the language of the day of the Lord for that final stage of history, or maybe the time and space after time when Jesus returns. That's what she means when she's talking about the day of the Lord. And she really wants us to hold in tension this idea of God's fully established kingdom after Jesus returns with our present. We have an idea of what's coming, and we should have an idea of what's going on now. And she's going to spend a lot of time having us hold these things in tension so that we know what to do with both of them now. And let's see, she said this is why the forensic imagery shouldn't be allowed to overshadow the apocalyptic motifs. The declaration in the courtroom, not guilty, is properly grasped only when we recognize that the categories of guilt and innocence simply do not exist as such in the new age of God, but are rendered meaningless by the apocalyptic gospel of the justification of the ungodly. So again, she's saying when we think about the apocalyptic nature of what's coming, God's kingdom fully established after Jesus returns, there's a lot more that's changed than just your status before God. You are righteous in this scenario, but that's all the law court imagery gives us. The law court imagery has to be coupled with the apocalyptic imagery so that we can see the way that sin and death is totally defeated, the way you've been liberated by the crucifixion, and the way that God is now fully present to us, running God's kingdom. There's a lot more going on than just your status there. And in the in-between time, she thinks God is actively at work. The ascension of Jesus doesn't have to just be like a, hold on, I'll be back, and everything's quiet. It's like there's a different kind of quiet or absence here than what happens on Holy Saturday. Right? Jesus dies on Friday. Saturday is long and quiet and weird. Nobody knows what's going on. Then Sunday happens, the resurrection event. Then Jesus is here for a while, and then Jesus leaves. But we're not just stuck in a long Holy Saturday, Rutledge says. She thinks God is at work in really invisible, quiet, but massively important ways now, by way of the Spirit. And the idea is that history is basically playing out, she says, where the Spirit is transforming things. The effects of the crucifixion are kind of like taking over the situation. One of the images that might be helpful here is if you have like the water cooler in the back. If we get some food coloring and drip some red food coloring in the top, I can put a fixed amount of food coloring in the water cooler, and it might take some time for it to actually fully melt to where the color changes, right? So if I put 5 drops of red food coloring in the cooler, and all you see is the red at the top of the water, you can see it's like slowly starting to take over the cooler, right? It might take a little while before all of the water cooler is totally transformed into red. But 10 minutes later, after it's been stirred up or the food coloring is actually set in and like diluted everything, there's no more food coloring than there was at the beginning. It's just changed. Excuse me. It's just like played itself out historically. She thinks that's what's happening. Excuse me. She thinks that's what's happening. Oh, excuse me.
Need
I'm
some
gonna grab some water. The water is what got me.
You get the red water.
Yeah, I don't know what to do now that the water's clear. Anyways, the water metaphor is just about saying that we're not adding any food coloring. It's already in there, and it's going to take some time to fully melt. Let's see. She says, as such, the imagery of rescues and victory places the themes of reconciliation and forgiveness into another context altogether, where they're brought in under the heading of God acting to make right what has been wrong. And then and only then can the whole complex of ideas and images be located where it belongs, on the battlefield of Christ against the powers. I'm sorry, I think I'm really lightheaded and I need to sit for a second.
Sure.
Would you come up and take over for a second? I don't think so. Very strange. Yeah. Got really lightheaded. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah. Sorry. Strange. Okay. Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna keep it up here. Thank you. Okay, sorry, gang. Got very lightheaded and swirly. If it happens again, I'll just grab a seat for a second. That is alarming. Okay. I think, like if we go back to the metaphor of the food coloring, it's important for relish to say that this isn't Holy Saturday. God is actively at work now. Christ isn't having to do anything more because there's enough food coloring in the water. It's just having to be mixed up. It's just playing itself out. And the water cooler is like being taken over in a red by way of the Holy Spirit's invisible work. So if you go back to the top of page 2 and look at that point 3, she says, even now God's at work in invisible and transforming ways. And she's doing this to phrase reconciliation in a larger category of justification, apocalyptic, liberation, all of these things. It's just another way of her saying the law court imagery of your personal status, guilty to innocent, is only a part of what God is doing in the crucifixion. She likes the apocalyptic because of how inclusive it is. It's for the cosmos, it's for all people. It's overcoming the powers of sin and death. It's all of that at once. So point 5 there is that this is justification and reconciliation when it's part and parcel of the larger apocalyptic struggle. I'm going to reread this quote now. As such, she says, the imagery of rescues and victory places the themes of reconciliation and forgiveness into another context altogether, where they're brought in under the heading of God acting to make right what has been wrong. God is rectifying the situation. And then and only then can the whole complex of ideas and images be located where it belongs, on the battlefield of Christ against the powers. And she does like that imagery of a battlefield, because for what we'll talk about here in a second with the next chapter, the operative image she wants is not so much a law court scene. It is Christ's invasion into occupied territory. So it's almost like you and I are, there's a connotation of a prisoner of war where we're stuck. And there has to be somebody from outside of us who's going to charge into the enemy territory in order to free us. That's where we'll go in a second. It's a little more of a high stakes drama than it's an action motif rather than just a John Grisham novel, I guess. Okay. Questions about the greatest seas or this chapter? Questions or comments in general?
Got one here.
Okay, Greg Miller is asking a great question, Greg. If the law court imagery is personal or is it applied to all mankind? And is there a balance between the two? I think when we tend to talk about the law court imagery, it has an individualized connotation. It is about your status, you. And I think the reformers and whoever's making use of the law court image would say it is about you, though that saying it's like everybody's in their own law court, if that makes sense, their own courtroom. And the judge is the same in all of them, and all of the sentences is carried out by the same person with Jesus, but it does have that kind of individual connotation. Even if everybody has to go before the judge in the same way. And even if everybody's status is changed because the sentence is carried out by Jesus instead of you. But that individual connotation is one of the things that she wants to avoid. Because the apocalyptic narrative, that she's trying to put the law court within, is much more communal, it's much more cosmic. There's a lot of other stuff happening in there so that it's less about just your status before God. Even if, for the apocalyptic narrative, like Jesus's invasion into enemy territory to free you, it definitely changes your status, right? Rutledge isn't saying that. It just does a lot more than change your status. Thanks, Greg. I thought I saw another hand in here before I read Zoom. Yes, would you remind me of your name?
Michelle,
Michelle.
what exactly does Aziz mean?
That's a good question that I do not know the answer to. Does anybody know?
With the medieval court.
Okay, can you say more about the question was, what does the C's mean? And the answer is medieval court. Can you say more about it?
Not really, I just know it from English history.
Okay. Well, that's you've given us something that we didn't know, so that's helpful. Oh, no, don't be embarrassed. You can, if I can be comfortable saying I don't know, then you can ask the question. Other thoughts or questions or comments?
As part of her, I'm just thinking of I like what she says, is hold on to the court imagery, not that let it all be that, but if you're standing there by yourself, I guess the dark side of that when you're talking about sin is that, well, I can rationalize my way out of this. I don't have to fully accept guilt. Maybe I can sort of make my case and maybe have my case dismissed,
Yeah.
But if I'm there in a group, the shadow side of that is there are a lot of people I can hide behind.
That's right.
That both of those would be shadow sides of that court imagery. And being honest with that. That's what I'm hearing her call. It's like be honest about both standing alone and standing in a group.
I think that's really helpful. So Brad's saying there are shadow sides to like the collective corporate image and to the individual law court image. And maybe one of the things that Religion is doing is trying to keep them together so as to kind of force our hand to reckon with our own responsibilities. And then if the shadow side of the law court image is that there might be some rationalization out, or like it's just a status change and it's kind of easily done. I can wash my hands of it. And then the shadow side of the collective image would be like, it's everybody. Sin's like semi-autonomous, so it's less about just what I'm doing on a daily basis. And she's going to keep both of these images so as to say, no, you totally are responsible, but you're responsible in a way where you can't just rationalize or talk your way out of it. I think that's right. I also think Rutledge, this is a trend that we are seeing throughout the text where Rutledge wants to hold a lot of things in tension. She wants to rethink them, but she's not a fan of just like tossing it when you don't like its effects or when it's like too challenging. She's going to tinker with it in a way that makes the case of why we still have to hold it, which is, I think, pretty compelling. It's I think it's easier to throw out an idea because you can't work it anymore than to work it and like make sense of it and keep giving yourself to it. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, let's look at the apocalyptic war and Christus Victor stuff. This is chapter 9. I thought this was clarifying again. We've heard discussion of apocalyptic throughout, but it's nice to have it paired up with Christus Victor, and nice to have the full chapter on it. So I think a lot of the motifs, thank you so much, Lee. A lot of the motifs come to a head in this chapter, the apocalyptic war and Christus Victor. She's going to say that the crucifixion is an apocalyptic event par excellence. It is like the apocalyptic event at the highest level. And it is a decisive moment of victory in God's ongoing struggle to address and overcome the enemy that deploys the powers. The enemy that deploys the powers. When she's talking about enemy, she's talking about like the devil's included, but it's not just Satan like pulling the levers. It's death, it's sin as a semi-autonomous power, it's greed, it's all of this stuff that we are hooking ourselves up to. That's why we're responsible for our sins. We consent to these things. But they also dominate us. You can't get away from them now. They've taken us captive, and they've taken everybody else in the world captive as well. And the crucifixion is like the definitive address of those things. Rutledge stresses that apocalyptic, when it's properly understood, is a comprehensive worldview with a specifically ethical dimension. I like this chapter a lot because I think we start to get some of the clear ethical stuff. The crucifixion should have some bearing on the way that you move in the world, should have some bearing on how you conduct yourself for the rest of the day and tomorrow, all the way through the week. We've not heard too much about that yet, but we're going to start to get it now that she's going to focus on our kind of in-between time after crucifixion and before the return. And she thinks that the ethical implications of the crucifixion are most clearly understood when we come at it from this apocalyptic narrative. She thinks the model offers us a distinct way of reading history and historical events that also gives us a kind of helpful ethical program to live faithfully. So what I'm about to read is convoluted, but we're going to break it down piece by piece in a second. So this is point C here is just my attempt to get all of the stuff that she's giving us into a kind of a cluster definition of apocalyptic. Apocalypticism features an ongoing dialectic, negation and affirmation. Dialectic just means like two opposites held in tension and they're interacting with each other. An affirmation and a negation. Sometimes they might synthesize to a third thing, but it tends to be like two poles, the dialectic. It's an affirmation and a negation that points to an ongoing radical transformation of the present world order, ruled as it is by sin and death. It's ongoing because the food coloring in the water cooler is still dripping down. The Spirit is at work in invisible ways, transforming the present order. And because of that, the apocalyptic imagery helps us negate things as they presently are. The water that's not yet been transformed, the grip that sin and death and greed has over our world and ourselves. But it lets us affirm the new thing, right? We know that the food coloring is going to take over. We know it's already been put into the cooler. It lets us negate where it's not been applied to, and it lets us affirm this new way of doing things. Right? The water will not stay clear forever, is the point. All of that is given to us in apocalypticism. She thinks this implies a handful of different things. So the first is that a new thing has been apocalypsed, which is to say called into being by God. This new order, this new way of being and doing, like how things will be in the wake of sin and death being finally defeated and overcome, that has already been called into order by God. It's like a breaking in of a new thing. And she thinks it features a break between the old cosmos and God's new coming kingdom. There's a whole new order on its way, a whole new way of doing things. She thinks that apocalyptic means that God is acting from the outside, right? You are so captive that you are incapable of freeing yourself. Really, the prisoner of war imagery breaks down just to the extent that a prisoner of war might sometimes escape. This probably, I have no idea how I would even learn stats about this, but there's some possible condition for escape. But the idea here is that you can't get out of it. You are so dominated by sin and death that there is no escaping it. The only way you're going to get out is if you are rescued by somebody else who charges in. She thinks that there's hostile forces at work in the in-between time. Just because sin has been overcome in Jesus doesn't mean that the powers have been eradicated. Everything, it's like almost like the heat is turning up as the tension plays out between these things. The Spirit is carrying out invisibly what is started in the crucifixion, and the heat and the pressure are all of the more while we wait for this new order to finally take over. The tension between the old and new, or the dialectic of affirmation and negation, she thinks is perfectly Pauline. It's very much a bifocal perspective that she thinks is precisely what Paul was trying to give us. It's neither otherworldly nor this worldly, it's both. A lot of times we'll hear criticisms of certain brands of Christianity being otherworldly. It's just about heaven, right? Where there's very little care about you and your daily life here, or the planet, or justice, or any of that stuff. It's otherworldly. Like that, this stuff doesn't matter because we only care about that stuff. Some of the correction to that might be a this worldly Christianity, where we're not even going to talk about heaven or the return of Jesus because everything we need is right here, right now. It's already been given to us. These are both popular trends that Rutledge, again, doesn't like. She doesn't want to take anything away from us. She wants you to have both of them. It is this worldly, which you should be attuned to, which you should be seeing the way that God is playing the effects of the crucifixion out in history, and it's otherworldly. This is not all that we have to hope for. This way of doing things is not going to be around forever. It is similarly neither totally present nor totally future oriented. It is not just now, and it's not just the future. It's paying attention to both this world and the next, now and the future. It's bifocal in that sense. And it views both at once, the present evil age with one eye and the age to come with the other. And the real task, Rutledge thinks, is how do you navigate the present world, dominated as it is by sin and death, in light of the coming age, the one that you have a share in. Another way to get at this is, what does Jesus actually mean when he says the kingdom is at hand? What would it even look like to reach out and take it and touch it? Right? How do you participate in that one, in this one? Another way to think about this is if this world is some sort of political organization or country, we could say, but you were not actually a citizen of it. You have your citizenship papers for a totally different order and country, or a community, or a kingdom, right? So you are not in your homeland. You're traveling through this one, trying to figure out how do you operate by the rules of this other kingdom while you're here. In order to do that, you have to have this bifocal perspective. You gotta have one eye on the present age. You gotta have one eye on God's coming kingdom. That's where the ethical stuff comes into play, she thinks. So in summary, I'm at the bottom of page 2. In summary, God is acting in the present by the power of the Holy Spirit, working through the lowliest of men. God's continually pushing into occupied territories with dynamic force. So at the top of page 3, this is where we get the ethical injunction of crucifixion. From this apocalyptic perspective, she says, resistance against the powers is the primary ethical imperative. And when she says power, she's aware, very much aware of the political overtones of this, but she does mean powers. It's like sin, death. And she's comfortable with you resisting the powers, be they political or whatever, or social or economic, to the extent that they too are dominated by sin and death. Anything that touches the powers of sin and death is what you are supposed to be resisting. Your citizenship papers of God's coming kingdom are like the thing that you're going to use to navigate this present world, dominated as it is by sin and greed and death, and the devil. So for Rutledge, the apocalyptic perspective clarifies and strengthens the Christus Victor model. Again, that's just one theory of sanctification of Christ and the crucifixion. Like we are saved because Christ in the crucifixion is totally victorious over the powers of sin and death. And for Rutledge, the most important aspect of that model is its apocalyptic setting, which dramatizes and guarantees the agency of God. And then in point 3 here is where she stresses the invasion of occupied territory. In the crucifixion, Jesus storms into occupied territory so as to liberate you and me and everybody for all time. She thinks that that imagery is helpful because it shows that we are tyrannized inhabitants of a territory held by enemies. And we can only be liberated from somebody from the outside. We're held captive. It's really bad. We can't get out. Jesus storms in so as to set us free. And not just set us free, like don't get caught again, but to actually overcome the power so that they can't dominate or take captive anymore. And the apocalyptic nature of all of this helps us make sense of the already and not yet motif that is in Paul's writing, Romans in particular. Rutledge says on page 389 that being joined to Christ in his death and resurrection through baptism doesn't mean being lifted clear of the cosmic battle. It's an ongoing process in which those already defeated forces will be eliminated. Christians thus look backward and forward simultaneously, and we see Christ in death and apparent defeat and Christ's victorious coming age all at once. You see the present, you see the future. You see Christ's suffering and death that is also our liberation. It's the bifocal reading. And the primary ethical challenge is figuring out how do you be part of a new thing amidst an old thing? How do you be part of a new kingdom with some pretty wild values amidst an order and a system and a world that has no conception of those things? This is the ethical task of the crucifixion. Okay, questions or comments on that very wild apocalyptic stuff? Yes.
When you were first using the red dye metaphor in the water pool
Mhm.
and how it eventually would disperse throughout, I was thinking that does that imply that things are getting better and better and better? If there's going to be an effect
Mhm.
that is permeating all of the cosmos,
Mhm.
does that mean things are getting better? But I guess, it could be argued that they're not.
Mhm. Yeah. Tell me your name one more time. It starts with an N.
Michelle.
Michelle. Okay. Thank you for that, Michelle. Michelle said one of the implications of the water cooler metaphor, the food coloring, is that things are getting better, right? Because progressively the food coloring takes over the water cooler. And does that actually map onto our historical location? I think you're right, and I think that's probably one of the limitations of the metaphor, because I don't think with Rutledge's system, she's saying it's like we're halfway towards overcoming the stuff. right? Or we're 3/4 of the way there, or there's really just a little bit of sin and death left. It will be, the implication is that it's a dramatic and kind of total at once elimination of those things at Jesus' return. And yet, she does want to say that maybe this is why she talks about the work of the Spirit being invisible. That we're not in like a stalemate standoff with the powers of sin and death. God is at work in the world, doing real things. So maybe we would chalk that up to the bifocal perspective. Things aren't like almost done because they're so good. And yet God's not just standing by while things get worse. Yeah. Is that fair or helpful? Yes. New Testaments. So Greg said the New Testament speaks of death in several forms. And sin, death, and law refer to physical death or spiritual death. That's a good question, Greg. I think she's primarily thinking about capital S sin or the power of death. Well, I bet she would want to do the all-inclusive thing of the physical tragedy of death, that's the effect of sin, as well as spiritual death, or the lack of real viable life by way of proximity of God. But I don't know. If you have any more comments on it, Greg, I'd be interested to see. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. In EFM, we read Howard Thurman book. And to me, his writing is similar to this, so it was surprising to me to see there's no reference that she uses to him. But part of what his conversation was is if you are someone with your back against the wall, meaning you have no way out, that the way out is through Christianity. And so with what you've been saying and what's here, to me, what she is saying is that the Christianity, the death on the cross, gives us hope that there is a way out. There is a door that's open that we'll be able to use. And I think that's the difference. And I think part of that's talking about the little s and the big S. But to take Howard Thurman's writings, where all of us that end up at some time in our life with our back against the wall, not necessarily, I liked his writing because he didn't focus on a specific people or a specific something, because all of us at some time in our life feel like our back is against the wall with no options. And Christianity is the option.
That's helpful. Will you tell me your name again?
Carol Putnam.
Carol made the helpful connection to Howard Thurman's writings from EFM and the language of having the answer to the problem of having your back against the wall is Christianity. That's what Thurman is saying. And that does seem to be a pretty thick connection there with what Rutledge is doing. It is a little surprising she doesn't engage with them. Would you check the back of the book to see if he comes up? You already did. Not in there at all. Interesting. Because I bet if she were here, we would like, do you like Howard Thurman? And she would be like, obviously I do. That's interesting. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, let's do takeaways and then we'll do prayer requests and then we'll go. First is that the crucifixion is the perfect apocalyptic event and the decisive moment in the victory of God. For her, the most important aspect of the Christus Victor model is the apocalyptic setting, the apocalyptic way of reading it. This features an ongoing dialectic or a bifocal perspective. We are affirming what God is doing and what's coming. We are negating or denying the current order of things. The way that the present world is dominated by sin and death and Satan. And the primary ethical task that we're given in the crucifixion is to navigate between the two. How do we be a part of a new thing and this old thing? There's an important contemporary philosopher who puts the question of ethics really simply. She says, how do you live a good life in a bad one? I do think there's something Rutledge and apocalyptic about that. How do you live a good life in a bad one? How do you be part of a new thing in an old one? Okay. Let's do prayer requests. Does anybody have any pressing things that we should pray for this morning?
I would like us to pray for the persecuted Christians all over the world
Okay,
who are suffering.
great,
Give that to God.
great. Were you about to add something? Did I misread you? Okay. All right, let's pray. God, we come before you with thanksgiving. I'm grateful for today and the chance to be here and to reorient ourselves in the coming week. We ask for the grace and the self-awareness and presence to see the ways that you are already present to us. We ask for the grace to receive the good gifts that you are seeking to give us today, here, now. We ask for grace for those of us in the room or not in the room or wherever they are who have their backs against the wall. And we ask that you would give them the hope of this narrative and see them through in Christ's name. Thank you for waiting while I ensured that I didn't pass out. We'll be back here next week. Y'all have a good week. And thanks for the water.